Um, I'm going to start recording and okay, so Linus, a lot of people, you're living in New York, and actually, where do you live in New
I'm
York?
in Bedford-Stuyvesant, New York City.
So what's that like?
Oh, I used to have a lot of light out my window, but now it's summer, so there's a tree. So now I have no light, but I have green. I'm right on the edge of a like heavily Hasidic neighborhood. So if I like walk to or from Williamsburg, I walk through all the crowds. I get to hear them speaking Yiddish and like actually understand snatches of Yiddish because I speak German and they're sort of a stone throw away from each other. Um, I'm a gentrifier. I'm not proud of it.
Wait, what do you
Um,
mean by that?
well, I'm in this building that was built in the 30s that probably used to be a factory or something, and now it's like been renovated into these sort of lofty apartments, and I have a studio here, and like I'm part of the wave. It's like first the gays come, then the rich gays, then the rich not gays.
Interesting. Well, what was it
So
like? What was Bedford? Because I've never lived in New York City. I haven't been there in several years, but what was Bedford Stuyvesant many years ago before the
well,
so-called gentrification?
yeah, I mean, I think it's in process right now. I don't think it's been gentrified. I think it's happening. Some of it is just that it was a very black neighborhood, black and Jewish, and now there's like this increasing white population. Um, like honestly, I didn't know Bed-Stuy that much. I mostly hear from people who have lived here their whole lives about how much it's changed. I know there were times in the 80s and 90s when it just wasn't safe at night. That's what people have said to me. This is hearsay, but
And how long have you lived there?
oh my God, I just moved here over the winter, so I'm fresh. Yeah, and then I got COVID for a month, so I feel like I haven't really moved in.
Oh, you got COVID? Oh, because I know that New York City was probably the worst situation for COVID. And
Mhm.
I even heard about somebody recently who was extremely careful for so long, and they just went to New York and they wore their mask everywhere, and they still got COVID.
Yeah, I
Is it
wore my
because
mask everywhere and I got COVID.
is it because of the amount of people, the density, or
I mean, I don't know. It depends how far back you go. Like way back in the beginning, it's because it's like Italy was sort of the first hotbed, but then there was some conference that people had come back through New York, and so they brought COVID with. So New York was just hit
right?
first of all, and then the congestion. I don't know. Is New York the most congested city in America? That's my guess,
I
but
would say it seems like it. I mean,
it's
because
definitely up there.
well, especially with I mean, just Manhattan, it's everybody's packed on this island. And I mean, I know you don't live in Manhattan, but it just seems like if everybody's packed there, it seems like it extends.
Yeah, so I think it's the congestion, just getting hit so early. Um, it was scary at first. It was great. I remember those first few weeks just hearing the ambulances more and more and more every day and just feeling and passing by the trucks and knowing that they were ice trucks for the dead bodies they didn't know how to dispose of outside of hospitals. It's just like what hellscape am I living in?
Yeah,
Crazy.
so yeah, I interviewed somebody else for the INBA podcast, and he said the same thing. He said you see these trucks and you know what's inside, and it's really horrible. And I think people thought it was like
Yeah.
New York centric, but it's definitely hit the nation eventually. So
I mean, there was also a solidarity that came out of, you know, losing people, feeling totally trapped inside. But then watching all these, I remember watching these nurses and doctors come flock to New York, basically to be in the front line of service. It was really impressive acts of service. And so, we banged on pots and pans for the healthcare workers, which is like cold comfort for them, but it definitely helped build solidarity amongst the citizens, I guess.
yeah. So are you from New York or where are you from originally?
Hard question to answer. I'm a third culture kid. It's the sort of the preferred term, which means I wasn't raised in my parents' home culture, but I also it's kind of like I don't feel at home in the culture I was raised in, but I also don't feel at home in my culture, my family's culture. So I grew up. I was born here, and then a few months later moved to Russia for a few years, and then Belgium for a year, and then Hong Kong for 7 years, and that's where I spent Hong Kong. I spent most of my late childhood, And then New York, um, on and off since I was 11. So I consider myself kind of a New Yorker.
Because I've met missionary kids who are third culture and they've lived all over. But what were your parents doing?
My parents were journalists, so
Wow.
foreign correspondent journalists.
Gosh, what was that like? Did you see any action or?
I mean, I think the most exciting time was when they were in Russia because they were being trailed by like KGB agents basically, and their phones were tapped and they had to drive home different ways every night, like because they knew that they would be followed. Um, but I was too young to really notice that. In Hong Kong, it was mostly just like traveling a lot for work. Like I remember my parents were traveling. I have a lot of letters from my parents, like from when I was very young, being sent to me sort of from on assignment in various countries and cities. But the good thing is, being in Hong Kong meant that, we could travel to India or travel to Vietnam or travel to, kind of anywhere in the surrounding area at the same price that you would travel to Yellowstone in America, so I got to go to Tokyo, I got to see Asia. And usually get a pretty like low frills experience, because my parents are not like resorty people. It's very much like, okay, who do we know that can connect us to locals? Like the best trip that I ever had, it was just so magical. I was 9, almost 10, and we went to Tibet. We went to Siahe in Tibet, which is a tiny by my standards, but it's a sort of pilgrimage town, with a huge, they call it like a prayer wheel. It's this building that is sort of a center of meditation, and you walk around the building and you push these handles and these wheels spin as you push the handles. And so the whole building feels like kind of a samsara cycle, or I'm probably botching the religious and spiritual specifics, but it was just this like pilgrimage site. And we played soccer with like Tibetan monks. We played soccer with like other 9-year-old monks in their saffron robes, and like my parents met the elders, and the elders told my parents about being tortured at the hands of Chinese. And then they like showed us their bear. They had like a bear in a cage, which is straight out of Midsummer, by the way. I don't know if you've seen Midsummer, but they have this like, oh yeah, that's the bear. And I was like, I had that exact experience in Tibet.
Gosh. So what was it like to have all those experiences? Well, first of all, why do you speak German fluently?
So after college, I moved to Berlin. I didn't really intend to. I just sort of bought a ticket and then never returned for a while. And because I was raised with languages, I picked them up quickly. So I picked up German pretty quickly. I have probably like a pretty street German, like because I'm an actor, I could fake the accent pretty well. So sometimes people think I speak better than I do. But I would say the moment vocab gets particularly technical, I get pretty lost. The moment clauses become like
Right.
2 or 3 sandwiched together, I get lost.
And well, when you were, gosh, I mean, so many questions because I lived abroad and it changed my life. I cannot imagine growing up abroad. And also, how do you, the issue of repatriation, was that even an issue? Because where is your country really? I mean, how do you perceive that?
Well, I've faced a lot of racism when I came back to the States. People thought I was Chinese. They would say really messed up things I don't want to repeat here. And it was just really, I mean, like, racism has been everywhere for ages, but there was a specific, something about racism against Asian people has been so unchecked. And like, especially in the like 90s, 2000, early 2000s, like it was very socially acceptable amongst otherwise liberal, like anti-racist people. It just seemed like,
really,
I mean, it was, yeah, I mean, like, you see it in like, whole actors have built their careers off of playing racist stereotypes in films, like, what's his name? Ken Jeong. Is that his name? Kevin Jeong, Ken Jeong.
What do you play?
In The Hangover, whatever. Like, and I
that.
don't begrudge him. I'm like, get that Hollywood money, but I'm also like, that you can play into this stereotype because that's what Western audiences are comfortable with and familiar with. And so, like, Parasite winning winning the Oscar is like, I don't think it's like, oh, it's changed, we're fixed, but it's like a step in the right direction for sure.
Wait, why do people, are you partly Asian at all? Or
No,
so why did they think you were Chinese or Asian?
I don't know, because they were 10-year-olds and they were like, oh, you have squinty eyes. I
Oh.
mean, they would say really racist things to me about.
Yeah, I mean, well, because yeah, I lived in Asia. What's really weird is that people have asked me if I was born in China because it was like a thing of telephone. There was some rumor, but whatever. I mean, not that I'm
Mm.
Chinese, but they thought I was part of that or something. But so, but yeah, yeah. So you moved back to the US, and what was that like to move here? Supposedly we have a very multicultural culture, but did you actually encounter that?
Well, like I didn't, I hadn't, I guess I knew Jews, but it's like when I heard that people were racist towards Jews, I was like, how do you even know? Like, I don't know what Jews look like. Like, I just didn't have that cultural, and I still to this day, I'm like, oh, you can tell somebody's Jewish. Like, I wasn't raised with that. I don't know it. I started going to some bar mitzvahs, and in bat mitzvahs, I was like awkward, first kiss territory and stuff. It was like ridiculous. But so there was definitely some, new multicultural experiences around that. Um, and
But are you Jewish at all or not?
no, I'm not. I just mentioned
Okay.
that because I moved right as people were starting to have bar and bat mitzvahs. So it was
Okay.
this whole new world for me. Um, but yeah, I mean, to be honest, like it felt. I mean, my parents were also saying this, just that like the states felt very ignorant, and on the other hand, like
But where did you live when you came back here?
so we moved to Cobble Hill when I came back here, which now is very shishi, but at the time was like sort of still very Italian and not quite turning into the neighborhood that it's
Wait,
become
where's
now.
Cobble Hill?
Also in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. Okay.
Yeah. Um, now that I'm an adult, I appreciate that New York has so many different types that, one gets exposed to just by riding the subway or what have you, that there is an experience that like in more homogenous societies is really hard to get, that teaches people to be more tolerant, honestly, in some ways. I mean, in some ways it can backfire, but like living in Germany, which is a very homogenous society, a lot of Germans would try to like explain to me like racism doesn't exist in our country anymore. We dealt with that. And I was like, do you know any people who aren't white and German? Because that's not their experience. Like, it's just like, what? Like, because it's so homogenous. We're like, no, we love people of all colors without the like daily reminder that things are more complicated than that. And in New York, you get that daily reminder, like things are complicated. There is injustice. Like, so, I really value New York for that.
Yeah, I love New York. I mean, I haven't been there in a while, but gosh, I love New York. I love the people I met through these online classes who are based in New York. But yeah, well, I think it may be in Germany because obviously they had the Holocaust. They were perpetrators of a lot of atrocities. And I know that through their education, they teach people about what happened. And so and I have met a lot. I'm actually half German, but I have met a lot of Germans and they seem to be aware. So probably they mean like through their education, they're not like their ancestors.
Yeah, there's this sense of like, because I know some of my friends, they learned about the Holocaust for 5 to 10 years in a row. And so there's a sense of like, can you please stop trying to make me feel guilty for something I didn't do, which
Right.
is a fair point. It's just that, like, I think, I've heard a lot of Germans be like, yeah, you Americans are so obsessed with this race thing. Like here in Germany, it's like, we love all people. And it's like, yeah, but also like it's not that we're obsessed with it, it's that we have so many things trying to coexist that it's like becomes a problem everywhere you look. Like it's really not a settled problem. And
Right.
so Germany has the luxury of like not having to deal with the complication of multiculturalism. And I think multiculturalism is a really good thing, but it exposes some of the maybe unsettled prejudices.
Yeah, because I mean, you live in a city and so do I. In this city, I mean, Black people had to live in certain areas. I mean, so that's why certain neighborhoods look a certain way. And throughout the US, they had all these housing covenants and so forth. And it's disgusting. And people are trying to, discuss that and remedy it. And there's a lot of academic research on it as well. So, yeah, these are in front of us. So,
Yeah.
but okay. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Germany's the closest thing that I experienced to that in Berlin is the Turkish population. There were these really questionable contracts after World War II that brought a lot of Turkish people here there to Berlin or to Germany in general to sort of help reconstruct the country. And they ended up third culture in their own right. And I hear a lot of Germans be like, well, why don't they just like learn our language and try to like we'll respect them if they respect us. And it's like, oh my God, this is so twisted.
But I mean, everybody learns German though in school, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how it works with the Turkish education system, but I know there are areas that are sort of have their own schools and have like a very heavily Turkish population.
Mm.
And so it's like, there's some animosity in both directions around like, why are you sequestering? Why aren't you integrating? And it's the age-old question that like applies to every marginalized community, like integration versus like radicalization and difference, and like both, it was a big thing when I learned about the history of like marginalized sexual identities, is like there's a strong faction that's saying we're queer, which means we don't play by your rules and we're proud of it. And then there's this faction that says we're queer, which means we're not that different from you. We also get married and have normal families. And it gets really polarizing within those communities.
Yeah. I mean, especially I think as the more that you experience and the more that you read and so forth, then you are exposed to the complexities of society in the world. It cannot, it's hard to be simple about perceptions of how culture is constructed or how it should be perceived and so forth. But I do so how long did you live in Berlin?
I lived there for 3 years. And a small caveat, I don't mean to generalize that the German population is like woefully ignorant around racial issues. I just do think there's an everyday reality that they don't have to confront these questions as much.
Yeah, and I do want to say that my mom came from Nazi Germany, okay, and some of her family was killed, and they had to start over in the U.S. and most of her family left. They either went to England or here, and they also came from the Netherlands, and we went back. She was from what became East Germany. And we went when it opened up, we actually went back there, and she just refused to speak German. She just, she had a hard time.
Yeah.
But I have to say that I have met so many wonderful German people. And even though my mom, like, they didn't have a good situation, Jewish people didn't have a good situation, I feel like they've done a good job educating their people. And I don't hold any grudges against anybody. Like I've even met people who their grandparents were, their grandparents were Nazis and they did stuff. And I've had people even apologize to me. I'm like, no, it's fine. I mean, that's the past, that's the history. What matters is who the people are now and what they're doing. So it's a very different Germany than when my mom was living there. So
yeah, for sure. And I think there is a reality that like, this current generation is not responsible for what their ancestors did.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's also important that what I've learned is it's important just to judge people where they're at instead of what their ancestors did. Like I've even met people whose ancestors had slaves, and I'm like, but you don't have slaves and you don't condone that. So you're free. I mean,
it's a really interesting question because like, my parents, my whole life I've spent summers in this like small town in Connecticut called Stonington. I have my step grandmother is this eccentric Norwegian Jew who escaped the Nazis as a child, and she just like bought an abandoned church, and turned it into like a place where my whole family has congregated because there was a divorce and remarriage. So all these step siblings were able to come together in this like strange crumbling estate of a church. And as I've come of age and become an adult, like I start to learn about who the land belonged to before the settlers. And you go to these quaint historical sites, like the Stonington Historical Center, and it will be like, this land was first populated by settlers in the 1700s, blah blah blah. And it's like, first populated, excuse me, like what? There's no mention of the Eastern Pequods. There's a whole really brutal history there in terms of like who was cheated, swindled, and killed in order to get that land into the hands of Europeans. And so it's a question where my parents have this place with a little bit of land, and it's like, do we give some of this land back? Who wants the land? Like, we're not responsible for that, but we are responsible for like trying to make it more just today. And it's,
Well, the Hamptons.
reparations.
I saw
Yeah,
a
but what do reparations look like in a responsible way? I don't know.
actually my hometown, they have reparations. It's Evanston, Illinois, and what they're doing is they're giving people money for housing. But yeah, they and I read some articles about some people who received some money or help with their house. But the thing is that there is a documentary that I saw about the Hamptons, and the Native American people are still there, and they're trying to claim some of the land, say, well, hold on a second, before you build your house or whatever, you have to make sure there's not a burial ground. And I thought, and then a lot of the commentary about these East Coast areas is the signs say established in such and such date, but when did they really have settlers? And even Manhattan, there's a story about that. I mean, Manhattan was that kind of place. So it's complicated.
Broadway was a hunting trail.
Wow.
That's why Broadway has such a strange shape. It continues north and it goes all the way through Brooklyn. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
The Lenape people were the sort of, I think, the main community living here before.
So what is now New York? Another thing about New York, since I don't live there, is it true that New York sees themselves as like, okay, we're in New York, and then the rest of the country's like flyover, or do people not care? What's the sentiment there at this point?
I mean, my feeling being in New York is there's this like force field around it where like when I'm in New York, I can't imagine leaving. I'm like, I'm going to miss something. And then when I'm out of New York, I'm like, why the heck would I go back there? So it's like this weird force field where once you're in, there's this cult mentality. I don't know. I mean, the flyover thing is it's a question about our country and about what communities we value and who moves to cities, frankly, who moves to cities versus who doesn't, and usually the cultural implications that arise as a result of that. And I don't know what New Yorkers' general attitude is towards that, but there's still this classic New York pride of like, this is where it happens, like New York. It's where it all happens.
A lot does happen there.
Like,
so it's really incredible. Well, it's an incredible.
LA people are like fake. Like there's still that attitude.
Yeah, I know. Well, let's talk about, actually, let's mention your projects, because I know that you're in film and TV, or, you do all this different stuff. And well, first of all, what are the projects that you're working on? Seems like you do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I try to focus on directing and acting these days. So my big project right now is this independent comedy series that I've been developing with my co-creator Jocelyn DeFries, called Mark and Hector Turn Trash into Treasure. My computer needs to charge, but I'll keep talking while I get a charger. It's a sort of zany ensemble piece about a sort of older gay man and his eye candy houseboy and their misadventures. So that's Mark and Hector, and sort of this wild ensemble of characters along the way. And so
did you learn how to describe that in our pitching class that we're taking?
To be honest, I've been talking about and raising money for the series since a year ago, sort of today. So in building our fundraising campaign, I had to learn a lot of our pithy little sound bites and stuff like that. Like, for example, Jocelyn DeFries is a transgender actress. She created the character of Mark, a 60-year-old gay man, as a love letter to who she would have become had she been born in a different era. So that's a soundbite that she and I came up with while we were talking about the project, and it felt really right, and it felt like the way to name what we're trying to do with representation. It's kind of like, I don't know, there was a guy who talked to our pitching class who said, comedians have to bomb again and again and again, but maybe they get one good joke out of a bomb set. And so they take that joke and they add it to a set, and then they build a set out of those one good jokes until eventually they have a good set. That's like our, that's our one good soundbite that we added to our list of sound bites,
And you guys are mainly, right now you're on Instagram doing it?
We're on social media platforms posting teasers. We haven't released the first season yet. We're still in post-production. We have one day of pickups left. The show stars, among other people, Miss Peppermint from RuPaul's Drag Race, and Bruce Beckham, who you might know from gay porn. And
I mean, I don't know, but yeah, I know because you mentioned before. Yeah.
yeah, well, who viewers might know, let's say, and some other LGBT thought leaders. So that's my big baby these days. Other projects, I'll be acting in a World War II drama in August, playing a Nazi. Surprise, surprise. I've been cast as a Nazi since I was 15.
Is this
In
now?
high
Is this a
school.
film that you're in, or theater,
It's a
or
film
what?
I'm in. Yeah, it's a film I'm in.
Is this an LA thing? 'Cause you mentioned LA.
No, we're shooting in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll be acting in that. That's exciting.
Do you get these gigs because you have an agent, or?
I do have agents, but I also submit myself to a lot of stuff. I get sort of notices from various websites when things match my profile.
Okay.
So
Is that
between,
I am like your profile? Does that mean IMDb?
no, IMDb is great if you want to look somebody up, but there are specific casting websites like Actors Access, Backstage, and Casting Network. So the big ones that I use. Those are generally the biggest ones that people use, at least in New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so well, I was trying to figure out, why you're an activist. Because okay, first of all, I thought you were older, not because you look older, but because you have a maturity, you have a great attitude, and you also do not discriminate against age. And you're probably like, well, of course I don't. But seriously, a lot of younger people make comments and they do not want to hang out with older people because of discrimination, in my personal opinion, because I've just heard and seen different things. Okay. So I thought you were older, then you told me your age. And I thought, why is he so mature, etc. And then I read this incredible essay that you wrote for this publication for HIV positive. And it was so honest. And I was basically in high school when the AIDS HIV thing came out, publicly. And of course, it started several decades before in Africa and Europe, but it made its way here in the early 1980s. And I wanted you to talk about that because I think even though it's been around for a while in our country, I think a lot of people aren't aware of it or they don't think about it. Like, so for instance, when COVID started, it brought me back to those days because I thought, oh my gosh, I remember when we had to be careful. It didn't matter what your lifestyle was. It was just that this thing was around and there was a pandemic. And I read about those days and so forth, but can you just tell me about your experience with it?
Yeah,
And
I mean, the COVID thing is really interesting because I know a lot of elders who, gay elders of whom there are not many because of the epidemic, who were really traumatized by COVID, firstly, because it brought them back, but then secondly, seeing the government mobilize and seeing the response and just seeing how unjust it was, that this is what happens when people actually care, that this is how quickly we can get medical teams working on this. This is how strong the public health response could be if there wasn't this stigma and this attitude towards a marginalized community attached. Because there were so many years where like they couldn't even get Reagan to say the word AIDS. Reagan laughed and said, "Oh, that's the gay disease, right?" I mean, it's just sickening. So there was that trauma too for people. My experience with it, so when I seroconverted, which is the term for testing HIV positive, basically when you go from being positive, from negative to positive, it's called seroconverting. Your sero status converts. Happened when I was 23 or something, and I was living in Berlin, and I was sort of didn't really have a job, didn't have any health insurance in Berlin, didn't know what the hell I was doing. Had a partner at the time, but you know, it was like a fling. We were sort of having a summer fling, and then early on into our relationship, I tested positive, and it was it strained our relationship in this way because it was sort of like, oh, he felt like he needed to be this emotional support for me, but he only just met me. So I had a chaotic few years in Berlin where I was really lost to addiction, and I made some meaningful friendships, but not many. Most of my friendships sort of went away once I got sober and moved away from Berlin. They were sort of happenstance friendships, kind of like, oh, we're friends because we can benefit from each other. Maybe one of us has drugs, and the other one wants some, or whatever, things like that. And then when I was moving back to New York, after a few years of that, I sort of reconnected with my therapist who I had known when I was 13, and I connected with this amazing medical facility. Basically, I didn't know when I first got it, but I learned that HIV was a manageable condition. So I learned that you can take a pill a day and be as healthy as anybody else is, up to old age.
Now,
And
see,
I didn't.
when I was younger, though, when it first came out, they didn't have that. So basically, it was a crapshoot. Like, you can be HIV positive and never get AIDS, or you could get AIDS. It was just like there's no way to manage it. So
Yeah, and I thought that was still the case when I got it. I didn't know that that wasn't still the case. So there was a shock and a horror that, if somebody is raised with that understanding and they test positive, hopefully they wouldn't have to go through such shock and horror and sort of reckoning with mortality. I mean, I think there's always some reckoning with mortality with any lifelong condition. But then when I was moving back to New York, I had this really profound experience. A sort of mentor of mine who I met through the Generations Project, which is an LGBT storytelling nonprofit. They bring together older, younger generations in the LGBT communities. But a dear friend of mine, whose name is Reginald, they were sort of mentoring me and inviting me to these public action meetings with this nonprofit called Vocal New York. And Vocal New York is sort of this group of kind of passionate world changers, many of whom are living with HIV and living in homelessness and addiction, or at least have gone through that, who agitate around issues of inequality and injustice around HIV and AIDS and homelessness and drug addiction, and through agitation get lawmakers to change laws. So they've set up factions that go in to meet with the lawmakers, and then factions to demonstrate outside, depending on like who's better suited for what. So they're amazing. Local New York. But I was going to some of those meetings, and I remember sitting down with Reginald and some of the folks who runs Vocal, and they were saying like, why do you care about this? And I kept saying, I want to help people. I want to help others. I want to be useful, whatever. And they kind of blew my mind by telling me like, this isn't an others situation. You're somebody who's HIV positive. You're somebody who's dealt with homelessness and addiction. This is not a you and helping them. This is a we. And our goal is to move towards seeing it that way. So, I talk about like the fact that I had this experience of testing HIV positive, and I got really knocked off of my path of like sort of this charmed life that I was living as a pretty privileged white kid, or white presenting. I'm very grateful that I had the experience because it gave me a lot of humility, and it connected me to communities of people that I would have maybe not been able to challenge myself and see myself as a part of. It would have been very much like, oh, those poor people, I want to help them, as opposed to like, I want to help us. So yeah, but I've also always just been friends with older people. Like my two best friends are 40 and 63. Right? So
but there's something about you though that's different, because I met you in this online class, and then we met in like a side group, and I thought, gosh, he's so maybe it's because you had this shocking news early on, and do you see life differently now that you sort of alluded to that, now that you found out that you're HIV positive?
well, there's that sense of like, oh, this has made me part of a community of people that need help, and I'm one of those people that need help. Like, so there's the humility and sort of sense of broader context that's given me. I've done a lot of volunteer work in in the world of HIV and AIDS activism. My film work sometimes deals with it. But I mean, honestly, like I credit a lot of my sort of mental resilience with getting sober and becoming a part of like sobriety communities. I mean, it had to happen for me. I was really lost. And, 12-step attitude tends to be, let go of what other people are doing and try to focus on your peace. And so it's like this reckoning of here's what I do have control over, here's what I don't. Here's where I have a sense of overdeveloped responsibility that I can let go of. And here's where I have a sense of I don't want to look at my own problems that I need to probably look a little harder at. So yeah, I mean, I think like I had a lot more to prove when I was younger. I heard that from people who I'm friends with now. They were like, yeah, you were harder to get along with then. It seemed like you had a lot to prove. They said those words. Maybe I have less to prove now. I don't really
no,
know.
where did they think it was because you were doing all these things that you were hard to get along with, or what was the reason? Do you know?
No, like when I first got to college, I was like, I still love wearing bright colors, but I was like always wearing this really loud outfit. I brought my parrot to college. So I had my parrot like on my big African gray parrot on my shoulder all times, which those are all things that I would still love to do. But there was this aspect of like, I really wanted to be seen.
Mhm.
And I really wanted to be seen in a certain way and like appreciated for that. So I think probably that came off in terms of like the way I would talk about myself was probably a little bit more, like I like to impress people, and I was probably a little bit. I probably put people off a little bit when in an unexamined way, I was just kind of like performing this version of myself that I wanted people to like. I think that's probably how it is. But it's a lifelong process. Like I'm still in the process of unlearning some of that.
Because my perception of actors is that's what they do. Is that why you went into acting, or how long have you been acting?
Well, it's funny. So like when people ask me what my type is for acting, I say I'm a European with a gun. Just like I could be German Nazi, I could be evil Scandinavian, I could be spot, like whatever. Just give me like Russian who's gonna hold like these are real roles that I played on TV, like a Russian who's gonna hold up a small, gas station attendant and whatever, get him to give him money. So I mean, part of that is because I'm good with dialect, but part of that is just I have like an angular European face, I think. But you were asking, isn't that part of being an actor? I mean, like, especially with film and TV acting, the camera can tell if you're faking.
Ooh.
Like, not many people know what makes good acting, but everybody knows when it's bad acting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You just feel it. So, and that's harder to tell on stage because stage is already stylized. There's already something fake about it. So it's like this suspension of disbelief, but film is like so, I mean, there's still a lot of stylized stuff, but like I read an article, I haven't been able to find it since, but it was so brilliant. It was called the unwillful suspension of disbelief. That it's not that we sit down and we decide, okay, I'm going to suspend disbelief. We sit down, and even if we try not to, we can't help but believe the world of the film. We can't help it. And that's so powerful with film. And theater does that too to a certain degree, but film really pulls all the stops. Theater, you can kind of zone out and check your phone and lose interest. At least I can, more so than with the film.
But you were saying earlier about LA and it being like fake. But to me, isn't that where a lot of the actors are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I think LA is fake. I just know that I've encountered that attitude. I don't know LA that well. I've been out there a few times and for a week each time. I thought about moving there, but I have a hard time with like, it's not the fact that people are in their cars all the time. It's the fact that like a result of car culture is that there's no sense of neighborhood. There's no sense of like, oh, I'm going to wander to the park and like maybe I'll run into somebody and I'll like get some coffee and sit on the sidewalk and people watch. Like it just doesn't, I don't get it. That doesn't exist really. It exists within micro communities, but not really. So
that's why I love New York, man. Because I
Yeah.
mean, if I were well off, I would live there because it just seems like it happens. Like you just run into people. Then even in our online class, he was saying, okay, the teacher was saying, okay, I'm going to get together at such and such. I'll meet you guys there. I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to go there. But
But that was LA.
okay.
He's talking about he's going to be in LA.
Oh, okay. I thought he was also talking about New York. Okay.
I didn't, if it was New York too, I didn't catch it, but I know he's
Okay.
talking about a place in Melrose.
All right. Yeah, he's bi-coastal, but as they say. But yeah, so but the thing about acting is how okay, this is a perception I have about acting. I think that life it forces us to be sort of fake anyway. We have to play different roles. Like we play a role at work. I'm playing a role right now interviewing you. I play a role. You know, it's hard to be myself in a lot of situations. So I
Mhm.
think that acting is extra that. So is it like double not being yourself or what's it like?
Well, it's so great that you said that, firstly, because I was washing a dish preparing for this and I was thinking about learning languages and how like code switching
Yeah.
exists in our lives. We all actually speak multiple languages
Yeah.
within one sort of macro language. And so it's just like, and especially when you have these hybrid like Spanglish, or you enter like
Mhm.
Japanese absorbs words from English and just
Mhm.
like, with katakana, like says them with Japanese accents. So, you know, yeah, I mean, there's like an amazing model for thinking about therapy in our brains, which is called internal family systems. And it's this idea that like we're made up of a sort of a whole rabble of maybe shreds of our persona, or a whole rabble of characters that are sort of
Mhm.
like a jury. And there are the firefighters. Oh shoot, I'm not gonna remember. The firefighters, there are different categories of like the exiles, and there's a third one. But they manage our lives. So maybe a part of us is like, manages our finances, and that's sort of the earner. And then there's a part of us that's like, really wants to keep us safe, and that might be the rager, or maybe it's the person who like disengages, and that's the isolator. um so like I don't think there's, and then they talk about the organized self, which is like that we can be the boss, like the loving kind boss towards all of those different parts of us. And so, you know in some ways it's like, okay, which parts of me am I letting to the forefront and which parts am I not? And that's not me. It's just a sort of remixed version of me. And so with film acting, I think that's the goal, kind of. It's like, the more that I try to do something, the less rich something becomes on screen. It's a very subtle, usually with film acting, it's like before I've even decided how to react, my body, like, it's already happened and the camera caught it.
Wow.
And so
That
it's
yeah,
like,
that experience is so foreign to me because I'm never on film. I don't work in TV or anything. And I mean like and this is the first time I've done these kinds of video interviews are first, but I can't imagine being a certain way where the camera has to capture you in a certain way.
yeah, and I'm talking mostly about a close-up, to be honest. There's a very specific aspect of acting that has to do with when you're in a close-up. And that's usually what an audition is too, is like a sort of medium close-up.
So basically you don't have to live in LA to be an actor. That's the impression I got originally.
Oh yeah, I mean, less and less now. Firstly, there's a lot of stuff that shoots in New York, but secondly, auditions all went on Zoom for COVID, and many of them haven't come back, and they don't plan on coming back because it's cheaper and easier. They don't have to rent the space and hire the
Yeah.
person to roll tape. And
Mhm.
yeah.
But then I'm okay. Now I'm thinking you're very complex because first of all, you're multilingual, which is extremely fascinating to me. And you've lived in different places and you're third culture and you're an actor. So you've got all these different aspects of your personality and your pursuits. I mean, do you know other people like that? I'm sure in New York you meet some people like that. New York seems to be a magnet for people who are very unique.
Yeah, that's for sure. I'm trying to think if I know anybody who has the specific mix of things that I do, but I don't think so. But they have their own mix, I would say. You know, I mean, like, the one thing that's nice with this project, Mark and Hector Turn Trash into Treasure, is it's been a chance for me to say, okay, yeah, I do all these things, but right now the thing that I'm doing is this, and it's like my full-time job.
Yeah.
That feels kind of good, especially as a freelancer, because my creative pursuits feel sometimes splintered and often all these different directions. I'm not sure which project is going to be the one that catches my interest next, but that's the one that has the most traction right now and is the most ready.
Are you trying to get on TV with it, or what are you trying to do?
Yeah. We're bringing it to pitch, baby. Half-hour series, HBO,
Okay,
baby.
HBO.
HBO comedy, baby.
Now, this is interesting because if you do, or when, I mean, our teacher would say we have to say when. So when you do get on there, we'll know you when, because I'm interviewing before everything happens. And then when it does happen, well, my question is, are you going to invite me to the get-togethers? Are you going to give me a special screening? I'm totally joking. I don't know if I'm your target audience, so.
Who knows? You might be. I mean, we're having some sort of work in progress screenings and premieres that are private. So if you want an invite, just say the word.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like with acting, there's this kind of idea of the big break. And with a lot of people, I mean, with some people, there is a big break, I think. But even for people who have a big break, there's often a lot of smaller breaks, you know? So
Yeah, I was
like,
gonna say, like, what advice do you have for people who do want to go into acting and doing performance and so forth?
yeah, I mean, it's just like, how, like, what's within your control and what's not. And, I mean, I've had a real sort of burden of self-esteem being sometimes contingent on whether or not I'm seeing external success. And I make it mean something about me. And,
Yeah, because
it's just
athletes
not,
have
it's
that
not a
too.
nice, yeah, it's not a nice way to live. It's
Yeah,
not
because
a nice way to
I'm
feel.
reading, I've been reading some athlete biographies and articles, and they say the same thing. They say, their worth is dependent on their performance. So if they're doing really well, people love them. But if they get struck out or whatever, then they feel horrible. And you really have to believe in yourself and be independent of how people perceive your performance.
Yeah, the other thing that I'm hearing a lot of recently, which I really love and it rings true to me, is nobody knows anything. I was at a screening the other day. I'm not going to name specifics because it might be sensitive, but I was at a screening and my collaborator Jocelyn is old friends with the celebrity. Like they've known each other for ages. And so the celebrity was getting her photo taken on the red carpet, flashing and flashing, and Jocelyn and I had gotten our photos taken. But you can kind of feel when the camera crew were like, okay, who are you? Okay, next, like whatever. And so the celebrity is taking pictures, and Jocelyn's manager shoves her in and goes, okay, go. And then and then the celebrity old friend of hers is like, oh my God. And then they hug, and then they're both on the red carpet getting pictures taken. From that moment on, suddenly all the photographers are like, okay, what's your name, Jocelyn? What? Okay, what? And then they wanted to know my name and they wanted pictures of us. And it was like, now you care, like wolves to the flesh.
Yeah.
Because somebody else who you think is important thinks she's important. And she thinks I'm important. So like you didn't know anything about whether or not we were important. You just took your cues from that person. And I don't begrudge them. I mean, it's like they're just doing their job and their bosses want pictures of people that are important. Fine. But it really felt like, wow, this is how it works.
Yeah. Because I heard that in the entertainment business, if you have a lot of projects going on, people might all be attracted to you and they want you to do stuff. But if you have nothing going on, then they don't. So it's almost like you're so busy and then you get even busier because it attracts, success attracts people.
It's definitely that way for Peppermint, who's in our show. I mean, she's probably the busiest person I know of. And it just seems to get more stuff.
So, yeah. So being busy attracts more busyness. Although then again, you can fall out of favor and then people don't care. So, and also I think what I've learned too in recent weeks is it depends how you treat people. Because when we had those producer people or those people high up in the entertainment business, it seems like personality had something to do with it too. Like if you get along with people, then that'll open doors. But if you're difficult, that won't necessarily open doors.
Being difficult.
Yes. Have you
Difficult
encountered that
people.
kind of thing? Have you encountered that kind of thing in quote unquote Hollywood or what kind of TV shows have you been a part of? Like broadcast TV or cable or what?
Yeah, so I was on the Blacklist, and I was on Bull, which is a CBS show. Blacklist is NBC. I was on Law and Order SVU, which is NBC. Um, those were the big TV things that I've done. I've done some like smaller TV, smaller, less impressive TV stuff too.
So what was that
Um,
like? Were people generally cordial or?
well, like on Bull, I had this incredible experience where the director, Debbie Reinisch, it was like nothing that I've ever experienced in the TV world before, where it was like she wanted to Zoom with me after she cast me to talk about the character. She was incredibly nurturing towards me and encouraging and with ideas. And it was just so comfortable working with her. Like, and, my other experiences on TV were much more like the director has a million things going on. So I'm going to just try stuff. And if they don't like it, they'll tell me. And that's usually what I've been told to expect with TV is there's too much going on, especially if you're not a principal. I mean, I don't know, principal is a confusing term. If you're not like the lead, then you won't get that much direction. You're just gonna have to try stuff. And so, so I've kind of had it both ways. I had those experiences, and then I had this amazing experience with Debbie, where she was just like an actor's director and such a joy to work with. And Debbie's remained friends with like a friend of mine, and sort of, yeah.
Is she in New York?
She's outside of New York right now, but yeah, local.
And then, well, what do you do for for the downtime? Because I get the impression I've seen TV shows shot around here in Chicago, and it seems like there's a lot of downtime.
Yeah, I mean, like I would say, so in the Blacklist, I was part of this ensemble of German criminals. We were all like hired to break this guy out of prison, and we were called what were we called? The something five. What was it? I want to say Fab Five, but it wasn't the Fab Five. But we had this moniker because we were like world famous prison breakers, where we specialized in breaking into high security facilities. And I was sort of like, I was one of the leaders of the pack. Not necessarily the leader, but I was one of the leaders. And so it was me and this other actor, and then a bunch of stuntmen. And the stuntmen didn't really have lines. Like they sort of were like, yeah, in the background, but they didn't really have lines. But me and this other actor had lines. And so a big part of that shoot was just about building camaraderie with these people off screen and like just, chewing the fat and bonding. That was fun. And then, I mean, on Bull, like I had like skull and crossbones tattooed all over me. So like most of my time not on screen was preparing the tattoos all the way up until they were like, okay, we need him.
How long did that take?
Oh, like 2 hours. 2 hours total with makeup too. And then it takes like an hour to take it off. And
Now,
I was
are
like,
you?
what?
Oh no, as I say, are you in character before you get the tattoos on, or before you got the tattoos on, or do you get into character once you have all that on you?
The auditions that I've booked for TV, they came so easily and so quickly. And so, which probably shows in the audition tape that I sent, is like it just clicked in for me. So they weren't roles where it was like, okay, I really need to get in the zone. And like, but the thing is for Bull, so I played a Russian, and I don't speak Russian. I did live in Russia for a couple years as a kid, but I don't speak Russian. But they had me sing a Russian lullaby to my baby. I had like a baby, and I was a gangster, but I had like my baby with me. It was a very fun little idea. And so I had this Russian lullaby I was supposed to sing. So I memorized it weeks in ahead, and I was going over it and over and over and over. And then the night before, they were like, "Oh, legal, we couldn't clear those lyrics. Here, you have to learn these lyrics instead." Okay. And they sent me a whole new song in a language I don't speak the night before my shoot. So it was just like, oh my God. So I couldn't even think about character. I was just running those song lyrics again and again and again, all night and all day, leading up to my time. Unfortunately, it was a night shoot, so I had all day to learn it. But yeah, And then, you know, the Blacklist, like it was, you know, that was my biggest set I've ever been on. It was, you know, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 100 people on set. Um, and James Spader was in all of our scenes. And, you know, he's sort of the big wig in those parts. And it seems like he kind of runs the show. I mean, I think it's a lot of the time it's that way when there's a headliner who has a big name in a show. They're kind of the reason the show can exist. And so they get to call the shots a little bit. Like if they don't like a line or if they don't like the wardrobe choice or whatever, they have a lot of creative input. So I was really intimidated, you know, and it was all of my lines were in German too. And it's like, okay, this is not my language. Like, okay, what are we doing in this German? And then also like a lot of my lines were being changed on set because they were like realizing that there were maybe more naturalistic ways to say things in German. Like,
did they have some kind of German consultant or something?
So they had this amazing woman, Lydia, who I really loved, and she was sort of a dialect coach, and she spoke Russian and German. She was very multinational. But then one of my co-leads was native German, and he was like talking to Lydia, being like, you know, this really isn't how a native person would say this line. And so she was like taking notes on the lines from one of the actors, and then so my lines kept changing. Oh my God. And it was so stressful, and I was just like, anyway, I was so overwhelmed. But fortunately my characters, and there's this one scene we had to shoot where we were in a van. All of us were in this like back of a truck with all of our guns with James Spader, and we're like cheering around him and being like, yeah, we're gonna break in. Like, and all of my characters, like he was like kind of like speedy, you know, and all of his lines were all about like, yeah, it's gonna be the bomb, man, like in German. All of my lines were puns on bombs and explosions because I was like the bomb guy. It was very funny. But like, you know, we were running this scene with James Spader, and I have the last line in the scene where I scream like, let's blow it to bits, basically is my final line in German. And like, I just couldn't remember my line. So every time it came to that part, I would just shout made up German syllables. Cause I was like, I'm not gonna let James Spader see me completely forget the line and ruin the scene. I'm just gonna go for it. And like, none of the other actors spoke German except for the one native German speaker who kept looking at me like, what did that even mean? And then Lydia kept coming up to me and she's like, so, and I was like, I know, I made it up. Listen, I made it all up. And she's like, yes, you know and I'm like, I know the line is that. I got lost, okay?
But did it make it to the final cut?
No, I got some good takes. I got at least like a couple of takes where I said the proper line, but that was very funny because I think I thoroughly convinced everybody except for those two that I was on point.
Oh gosh.
You know, it's just like commitment, full commitment. But my third day on set was my character intro scene. And, you know, leading up to that, like a lot of the crew, they'll watch rehearsal, and based on the rehearsal, they'll decide like, okay, so these people seem like the main characters and these are not. And until then, like my character really wasn't that featured, even though like it's not clear who's the leader of the pack. Like the other native guys was sort of leader of the pack, but I had some leader of the pack qualities too. So we were the two guys at the helm. But so for this last day on set, like it was when my character gets introduced, and I was so nervous, but I had enough days on set where I was like, okay, nobody's gonna direct me, so I have to. And I kept picturing like a dog marking its territory. And I kept saying to myself, like, I'm just gonna pee all over this set. Like, this is my set. I'm gonna pee all over it. Like, that was my mantra that day. And so when we ran our rehearsal, I just decided to like do really weird things and just commit really hard to being a very strange character. And I remember the DP and the camera operator were like watching the rehearsal and kind of like, oh yeah. And then like I did some weird stuff. And they all laughed. And then he like turned to his camera guy and he was like, okay, so we need to set up a new light there and we need to set up another angle here. And I earned a close up.
Interesting.
You know, because they otherwise were like, oh, whatever, he's one of the ensemble. But then they were like, oh, this guy's weird. Like, so I got some good, so basically my character ended up featuring more heavily because I had enough nerve to try some stuff on that third day.
Right.
So that was my story. I don't remember how we got on that, but
No, that's very interesting. Okay, well, thanks. I know you have to go and live your busy New York life, but I really appreciate you taking the time and getting into some of these issues. And I suggest that people do a search for you online because they can read some of what I read and they can see how honest you are. So this is a really good interview. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks. It's been a joy.
Thanks.